We've all had that moment. You finish the book everyone's been talking about, the one that's all over BookTok, BookTube, Twitter. Everyone's raving about it. It has a shiny award sticker on the front cover, and you close it thinking, that's it. Was it bad? Not necessarily. Was it life-changing? Also no. And then the word slips out like a guilty confession. I think it's kind of overrated. But what does that even mean? Are we actually talking about the book itself, or are we talking about the expectations of it? Today, I want to unpack what makes a book overrated, how hype, culture, and personal taste collide to shape the way we value stories. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara, and today I am going to be doing an essay on a topic that I think a lot of us talk about, and that is what makes a book overrated, what does overrated even mean, and what are the implications of that. So today I'm going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes talking about this topic because I have talked about it in passing in other videos, and I thought it was time to actually spend some dedicated time to it. So let's talk about the myth of the overrated book. So let's start here. Overrated doesn't necessarily mean bad. What it means is that the experience didn't match up to the reputation of the book. It's the gap between what we were promised and what we got. When people call The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger overrated, they're not necessarily or really critiquing Salinger's prose. They're reacting to the myth of Holden Caulfield as the universal voice of teen rebellion. When someone calls The Atlas Six by Oliver Blake overrated, which I myself actually did when it first came out, they, and I really should say we, expected an intricate magical academia epic and got something that was a lot slower, a lot moodier, with characters that were not particularly well written, in my opinion. The book didn't necessarily change, our context did. So when we say something is overrated, what we're really saying is the story didn't meet the version of itself that I was promised. That expectation, that hype, is where the real story begins. So let's talk a little bit now about the hype machine and how books become overrated. Because there would have been a point where a book wasn't overrated and then for whatever reason it became super popular and then it becomes overrated. So let's have a little bit of a chat about this. And let's be honest, a lot of books become overrated before we even open them. And that is because there is an entire machine behind that. The internet, for all its love of books, is also a marketing machine dressed as enthusiasm. Take The Midnight Library by Matt Haig as an example. When it blew up, it was sold as a philosophical tearjerker about the meaning of life. For some, it was exactly that, and I remember reading reviews of the book when it did first come out, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. For others, the simplicity of its message felt too thin for the emotional build-up. Let's take another example, one that I've actually talked about in depth on my channel, and that is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. It is a perfect storm of fantasy tropes, spicy romance, and social media hype turned into the cultural moment of 2023. But once the hype cooled, and I've again talked about this quite a lot on my channel, I think a lot of people started to realise that the books are actually quite poorly written. There's uneven pacing, there are gaping plot holes, lots of inconsistencies, and the world building is extremely derivative. It was almost like for a while I was the only person actually critiquing this book, but there was a moment where someone pulled the switch and overnight almost it felt like that Fourth Wing was all of a sudden overrated. Now, none of this means that the books failed, but they do become cultural mirrors, reflecting what readers wanted and capitalizing on that. And that's what hype does. It builds a collective fantasy that no single story can possibly fulfill. Another layer here is marketing, because Marketing can often showcase a story in a different light, very different to what is actually written in the book. Often, publishers actually decide what they are selling. Sometimes a book's reputation isn't built on what's inside it, but on the angle that it sells. So as an example, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath gets packaged as a sad girl classic, perfect for pastel aesthetic Tumblr posts, but that framing completely flattens Plath's sharp critique of womanhood in the 1950s and also mental health. I've read that book. It is a very sad book. You wouldn't know that if you looked at how people talk about it on Tumblr, on BookTok. They romanticize the struggle that our main character goes through in that book, which is very sad in my opinion. Another example, one that I haven't read but I know a lot about, is Circe by Madeline Miller. It's often pitched as a feminist mythology, which it is, but that label massively oversimplifies what's actually a complex meditation on loneliness, power and immortality. Another example that I reviewed relatively recently on my channel was The Devils by Joe Abercrombie, one of my favorite authors, and yet all I heard about in relation to this book was Suicide Squad meets blah 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 blah. And that was instantly a turn off for me because I couldn't give a crap about anything related to a Suicide Squad setup. When a book's marketing distills it to one idea, sad girl, Suicide Squad, strong female lead, dark academia, it primes readers to look for that one feeling specifically. And if the book delivers something subtler, something harder to categorize, we call it overrated. Now let's talk a little bit about us, the readers, and the social psychology of taste. There's a psychological bias called social proof. We tend to believe something is good because other people say it's good. BookTok and Goodreads, Amazon reviews, these are all social proof engines. Even here on YouTube, a book with thousands of 5-star reviews feels safer to love or riskier to dislike. Everybody wants to feel like they belong to a community, even if they don't necessarily know the individuals in that community. When a book becomes part of that community identity, it stops just being about a book. It becomes a badge of taste, or the opposite of that. Saying you love Normal People by Sally Rooney signals that you value emotional minimalism and character-driven stories. Saying you love Brandon Sanderson signals you appreciate intricate systems and epic world building. And saying you don't like those books can feel like rejecting the entire community around them. That's why fandoms can often get very defensive when they see people disliking or disagreeing with their perspectives on the books that they love. So when we say overrated, we're not always necessarily evaluating the book. I think sometimes we are also pushing back against the cultural pressure to agree, particularly when we genuinely believe that thing is not a good piece of art. That all being said, books can be victims of their own success. I think sometimes, and I don't think this happens often, but I do think sometimes truly great books are often destined to be called overrated. When a story captures something universal, The Great Gatsby, The Song of Achilles, The Count of Monte Cristo, it spreads, and the more people it reaches, the more interpretations clash. A book loved by millions can't possibly meet everyone's definition of brilliant. So the moment something crosses from niche masterpiece to mainstream phenomenon, the backlash begins. It's a kind of cultural balancing act. We lift stories up until they wobble under their own weight. I want to give a quick anecdote of my own experience with this. Now, obviously, you have an author like Dostoevsky, who is one of the greatest authors to have ever existed, in my opinion. Now, a lot of people will take umbrage with that, not necessarily because they disagree with that statement, just because Dostoevsky is a very well-known, very popular writer. And I've seen this with other classical authors that I've read too. I think there is this urge sometimes to reject what is popular at a given time. Now, of course, if there is genuine kind of, I don't know, opinion that maybe his writing is not very good or the themes don't particularly resonate with you, that's a different matter. I think it's just interesting when people try to frame it as some sort of objective truth when objectively Dostoevsky is an incredibly talented writer, even if you don't necessarily enjoy those books. I'm going to be doing a separate video on this idea of objectively good fiction in the coming months. It's a video that I need to plan out quite a bit because I need to think about the angles that I'm going to explore in it. But I do think there are objectively good books. And I do think Dostoevsky is actually one of those authors, in my opinion. But we'll come on to that in a separate video. When something is considered to be overrated, I also do think that is something deeply personal, even though that can mirror a kind of societal movement to reject something that is popular. Sometimes we just read a book at the wrong time in our lives. For example, when I first read Wuthering Heights, you know, it must have been 15 years ago now, I didn't enjoy it. I thought it was overly moody. I didn't really like the characters, and it just kind of felt meh. But then I read it again in my early 20s, and I really appreciated how raw it felt, and how particularly Heathcliff's struggles I think are actually quite relevant in today's society. It was the same book, but it was a different Zara reading the book, and so I think timing can play a really important role in our reactions to the fiction and the art that we consume. I'll give another really popular example, one that I haven't read, refused to read, and I'll go on to that more in a second, and that is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. For some people, it is the most devastating, transformative story they've ever read. For others, it's incredibly emotionally manipulative trauma porn. And both reactions are completely valid. Now, for me, why I don't want to read it, I've tried reading it once or twice in the past, and I just didn't like the writing style, to be honest. While I love kind of stories about friendships and family and kind of finding yourself and figuring out what you want in your life, which I believe are some of the themes that A Little Life covers, I'm not really interested in the way that the author went about approaching those topics, because I've done a lot of reading about the book, which is ultimately what resulted in me deciding to not pick it up anytime soon at the very least. And I think this is important because reading isn't objective, even though I did just say that I think some books are objectively good books. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, the experience of reading that book is objective. If that makes sense. It's a conversation between who we are right now, and we are constantly changing and evolving every single day, and what that book is offering. I've had other situations where I've read a book when I was younger. It had a very different meaning to me than when I read it when I was older. I'll give you another really good example. If you've been watching my channel for a while now, you will know that The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas is my favourite book of all time. Or at least, very least, one of my top 3 favourite books of all time. I just love it. It is the most like heartwarming, fun, adventurous, but poignant story about like friendship and loyalty, relationships, figuring out exactly what you want to be doing. Like, it just covers everything. I've read that book probably over 5 or 6 times now. And each time I've read it, I have taken something different from it, because I myself as a person, I'm not the same person the 6 times that I read it, right? You know, I've gotten older, I have different priorities, my perspectives on the world have changed quite a lot, and that is naturally going to impact my reading experience of the book. So I truly do believe that a story can't meet us where we aren't ready to go. I think this is something that people often forget, and personal context is really critical in how you read a story, even if that book is very well written. That being said, I do think as well that sometimes calling something overrated is a kind of self-defense. It's easier to say that this book isn't that deep than to admit that it didn't move you the way it moved everyone else. There's a vulnerability, I think, in loving or falling in love with something publicly, especially when everyone else seems to feel the opposite. There's also a vulnerability in disliking something that everybody loves publicly. Fourth Wing is a perfect example of that. I did a deep dive into each of those books, the ones that have come out so far. And, you know, when you're critiquing a book, when you're critiquing the themes, the characters, that can say something about you and what you value in the stories that you enjoy. And that is you opening up in a way to people who watch your videos. So I think like overrated and even underrated becomes a shield, a way to reclaim control over taste in a culture that constantly tells us what to like. And maybe that's okay, by the way. Maybe it's a sign that we're thinking critically, not just consuming passively, which, as we all know, if you've been watching my channel, I'm a big fan of. I do think it's really important to remember that, because if you're just calling a book overrated just for the sake of it, then I think there's something to be said for that. But I think if you're doing like a critical analysis as to why you didn't like something, I think there is a lot of value in that. So what actually makes a book overrated? If I had to answer the question, and I'm sure everybody has their own opinion, I would say it's when a book's myth becomes louder than its meaning. When the conversation around it, the hype, the discourse, the memes outgrows the story itself. It's when a book stops being something you read and becomes something you're supposed to feel a certain way about. That's not necessarily the book's fault. It's just what happens when stories become a part of our culture. I think as well, another angle to this that I think about often, that I don't even necessarily agree with at all, but something that I think about, which is when my enjoyment of the book doesn't necessarily match up with the quality of the book. Now, I've said this before, quality and enjoyment are two very different vectors to determine whether a book is good. Generally, I think you have to factor in both. I've said before, I rate my books now on two different scales. One is enjoyment. Did I have fun with it? Did I like it? Do I want to continue on with the story? And is the writing good? Are the characters well developed? Is it paced well? These kinds of things, the mechanics that actually go into writing a story. And I think sometimes for me, I find that the books that are often overrated, there is a mismatch between those two vectors. So I can enjoy the book, but it's really poorly written. And I just didn't like the writing, but I could get over it because I was enjoying, at least at a very high level, what was going on. And also the inverse of that, you could also think a book is technically well written, but you didn't necessarily enjoy it. And I think sometimes that can lead to that feeling of something is maybe overrated, because again, the two vectors are kind of at odds with each other. And when there is that mismatch, it kind of feels like you haven't been satiated. So I think that is what makes a book overrated. It's when the expectation falls flat in any way, and it kind of makes you feel like you haven't eaten a good meal, if that makes sense. Maybe calling a book overrated says less about the book and more about what we wanted it to be. So the next time I finish a hyped book and feel that disappointment that I inevitably feel, I'm going to keep asking myself, was it the writing or was it the expectation? And that is definitely something that I do anyway, but I'm going to try to be more conscious of it. Because the truth is, no book can be universally loved, even if it's like the most well-written masterpiece. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be universally loved, and that is okay. And maybe that's what makes reading really beautiful. We each find meaning in different corners of the same page. So overrated is kind of one of those terms that at the same time means something, but also doesn't really mean anything. And ultimately, reading is subjective, even though I still stand by this. I do think there are objectively well-written books, but your experience with that book is going to be contingent on so many different factors, from who you are as a person, from where you are in life, to many other things, your cultural and societal expectations, where you were raised in the world, your prejudices, these sorts of things, right? We all have these factors to think about. I think this is an interesting conversation because we are talking about something where each individual's experience is fundamentally so subjective. So I'm really curious, what are your overrated books? How do you classify something that is overrated? Like, how do you define it? Tell me in the comments and I will see you down below. And remember, you're allowed to have unpopular opinions. It's totally fine here. My channel is basically just unpopular opinions at this point, so it's fine. And that's also what keeps stories alive, so there we go. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this very casual chat about overrated books, and I will see you in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Stay safe as always, take care, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.